The story begins with our female protagonist, Evie Artino. She was a lovely girl cherished by many, possessing an irresistible charm that captivated everyone. The spirits had also bestowed additional powers upon her. However, it turns out that she was a poor, miserable girl in her previous life. The happiness she experienced in this life was actually her second chance at redemption because she was an orphan, abandoned by her relatives. She had a terrible life ever since she was a child, often fighting to make ends meet. Education was her only way to improve her life, but she couldn't achieve anything even with that. Until she reached adulthood, she remained a poor, powerless person. However, life goes up and down like a spinning wheel, and one day, after meeting a spirit in a lake, her life was transformed in an instant. It all started after a long day on the job when she looked down at the lake and noticed a tiny girl shimmering in the light. The sight startled her, fearing the child would drown and require rescue. Unaware that the girl was a water spirit, she dashed to the lake, completely disregarding her own safety. As she got close to the spirit girl, she felt a peculiar sensation, as if her hand were entering the spirit's body. She didn't realize she was in the center of the lake because she was so shocked, resulting in her sinking and losing her life. However, her suffering was brief, and she woke up not long after hitting the water's bottom. As she woke up, she wondered if she was in the afterlife, and if so, whether she was in heaven or hell. She even went so far as to believe she was damned to hell for failing to settle the mountain of debt she had acquired. Suddenly, a tall male spirit with silver hair appeared before her and assured her that she was not in hell. She wasn't too surprised by the male spirit's presence but wondered if he was actually God, given his human form. The girl's response to his appearance perplexed the male spirit, who considered her to be an ignorant human. He felt it was only fair to call the girl an idiot, as no one on earth would risk their lives to save a lake spirit. He told her the exact same thing. She was not expecting that the girl she saw floating on the lake's surface was a water spirit, so she was astonished, and her expression said it all. After that, the spirit explained that the water spirit was floating on the lake's surface because she was pouring into the realm of human beings as he was opening a dimensional portal. After explaining everything to the girl, the male spirit thanked her for trying to rescue his child, the water spirit. That's why he planned to offer the girl a present to thank her for risking her life to save his child. She was hesitant because, among other things, she wasn't too sad about her death and thought the reason she died was absurd, that she had been so lonely and unloved while she was alive. To show his gratitude for the girl, the male spirit bestowed upon her the opportunity to be born again. The girl was taken aback by the male spirit's words because she had no idea she would receive such a precious present. While overjoyed, she couldn't help but feel anxious that she might be thrust into a life she had never desired. As a result, she pleaded with the spirit to grant her a happily ever after. Recognizing that she had never prayed before, she begged with a hint of shame, but this time she pleaded and prayed for a joyful life from the spirit. The spirit already planned to grant her a happy life as a gift even before she asked because he thought the girl was incredibly generous and willing to help others without expecting anything in return. Nevertheless, the spirit warned her that there would be consequences to accepting the gift. The end result was that each time she was born, her memories would gradually fade, and she was fine with the outcome. Once the girl had discovered and accepted the outcome of her gift, the male spirit started the ritual of bestowing it by placing his hand on her head, symbolizing the process of bestowing a second chance at life. The procedure of bestowing a second chance at life on this girl was brief, as she was thereafter reincarnated into the joyful world she had dreamed of being born into, the Artina royal family. She was given the name Evie Artina. Though the male spirit's gift-giving to Eve was super quick, the process in Eve's next life was laborious. It took 7 hours for her mother, Alicia Artina, to give birth to her. Beyond that, Cedric von Artina, her brother, and her father were outside the chamber waiting expectantly for the birth as well. While his mother was giving birth to his sister, Cedric attempted to reassure Hugo, his father, that everything would be all right. Additionally, he begged his dad to get some rest, as he'd been waiting at the door for 7 hours, all the while worried about his sister's birth. Despite Cedric's best efforts, his father stubbornly stayed at the door and refused to leave. After 7 hours of worrying, the sound of a baby girl's cries filled the air outside. Eve's cries put an end to their fears. They were so intrigued by Eve that they hurried inside Alicia's chamber without hesitation. Hugo was surprised to see his wife and newborn child when he arrived at Alicia's room. Alicia was overjoyed to see her husband arrive because she had given birth to their daughter. Hugo then hugged Eve close, his heart racing with emotion as he kissed his wife's forehead. He had always wished for a daughter, and a wave of emotion washed over everyone in the room. The joy evident on Cedric's face and sparkling eyes upon seeing the birth of his sister was contagious. Since the Artina family had only 2 sons, Aaron and Cedric, it was understandable that they awaited Eve's birth eagerly. The love and care that the Artina family and the palace servants had for Eve became more apparent. For instance, Cedric would covertly skip sword class to visit his sister, Eve, and he frequently went by her room. Unfortunately, Eve had just finished eating when he purposefully skipped class that morning, and she fell asleep. But once Eve heard Cedric's voice, she sat up in bed. She attempted to put on a charming expression as Cedric caught sight of her, knowing that he had missed sword class just to see her. Because Eve's expression was so cute to Cedric, he was naturally overjoyed by this. Beyond all the joy, though, Eve had begun to get bored with her routine of eating, sleeping, and pooping. The servants' tales about the kingdom were another source of entertainment for her. A servant once told her that her father wore a thread bracelet on purpose and was so careful not to fight knights so the bracelet wouldn't break. According to the legend, a particularly lovely child would be born into the world if the father held on to the bracelet all the way to the moment of birth. Thus, the maids contended that Eve's stunning good looks were inevitable. Even more, tales of her responsible and disciplined older brother, Aaron, came to her. Eve grew terrified of meeting Aaron because she anticipated that he would demand extreme self-control from her. However, the news of her birth had not reached Aaron until now, as he remained in the north on a royal assignment. Thus, it appeared as though Eve's thoughts were not coming true yet. Aaron found he had a younger sister when he and his company arrived at the palace a few weeks after Eve was born. The royal family and their attendants were overjoyed to see him return safely from his royal responsibilities and greeted him with open arms upon his arrival at the palace. He wanted to know how his parents were doing, and his dad broke the news that the palace was in trouble right then and there. Aaron's expression darkened as he feared for the safety of his family while he was gone. It became clear that his dad was joking, according to his father. Eve shared the same stunning good looks as Alicia, Arkin's mother. Even though Eve couldn't talk just yet, his dad made a joke about how she could say Papa instead of Mama already. Since Aaron hadn't spent the last 8 months in the palace, he found his father's explanation peculiar. For 8 months, he had no idea what had transpired at home. After that, his dad instructed him to visit Eve in her room, where she was waiting. Aaron explained to his father that as a public servant, he had a responsibility to keep him apprised of his work's progress, as the public good should always come before personal interests. After hearing Aaron's response, his father became dissatisfied. In the midst of his conversation with his father, Cedric sprinted towards Aaron, draping a cloth around Eve while still left within the palace. He then called Aaron by name. Upon seeing what Cedric was holding, Aaron was taken aback. Cedric then revealed Eve's face to Aaron. In the beginning, Aaron and Eve locked eyes but said nothing. After realizing that her demeanor would not win Arkin's heart, Eve made an effort to demonstrate her charm by showcasing her skill to make herself appear adorable, in the hopes that Aaron would fall for her. As expected, Aaron couldn't help but be in awe of his stunning sister. When Eve extended her hand, Aaron looked up, but Cedric interrupted him, saying that he was going to tell his father about the results of his work. Because Aaron valued seeing his sister's adorable face more than reporting on work, he was irritated to hear that. Additionally, he made the irritating claim that the report was no longer a top priority due to his being captivated by his sister's stunning appearance. That evening, the Artina family hosted a formal meal to greet Aaron, who had recently returned from duty in the north and was due to arrive at the palace. It was Eve, though, who was the center of attention as her father and 2 brothers battled for control of her at the dining table. A heated rivalry broke out. It all started when her father complimented Eve and then requested permission to carry her. However, Cedric intervened, saying that his father must be exhausted from taking care of the kingdom. Therefore, it would be preferable for him to carry his sister instead. Though Cedric was no match for Aaron, the two were equal. He told Cedric that he was only 7 years old, which was too young to be carrying a child like Eve. When Eve's mother overheard their quarrel, she decided to feed her some fruits instead of letting her go to anyone despite her dislike. Eve ate the fruit that her mother had given her. She then had the bright idea of sharing it with her dad or her two brothers the next time around. As soon as she saw her father or brothers, she reached out and took a piece of fruit. People began to compete for the fruit she was offering, even though Eve didn't actually gesture to anyone. Everyone thought her hand was indicating their body because it was so attractive. Eve tossed the fruit far behind her two brothers and father. Eve experienced a loving embrace from the Artina family that she had never known in her past life. Despite the fact that mundane and humorous events like these occurred in her own, she wished this way of life would continue for a very long time. As Eve's father got ready for her birthday party, her wish for a happy life seemed to be coming true. In an endeavor to commemorate Eve's birthday, her father sought Emperor Carlisle's approval to use the dining hall of the Imperial Palace. Hugo visited the Imperial Palace that very morning. When he arrived, Carlisle greeted him with a lime. Hugo explained his goals and objectives for visiting the palace. After they had spoken for some time, Hugo, not someone accustomed to asking for things, astonished Carlisle with his request. There was no imminent plan to use the royal palace's dining hall for anything other than state dinners or the emperor's birthday parties, which further surprised him. Hugo clarified Carlisle's suspicion that Aaron would borrow the banquet hall for his engagement, since he planned to host his son's engagement at the manor house. Further, Hugo announced that he was going to celebrate Eve's birthday by borrowing the banquet hall. Carlisle was taken aback, nearly insane, to hear Hugo's explanation. Forgetting the banquet hall, claiming that it was too much, nevertheless, Hugo was not aware of Carlisle's response due to his immense love for his daughter. Not only did he seek approval for Eve's birthday party, but he also sought permission ahead of time to use the banquet hall again after Eve was old enough to be welcomed into society. Hugo rushed away, leaving Carlisle bewildered by Hugo's plea. Assuming that his permission had been accepted without a word of approval from Carlisle, he took a basket of limes from Carlisle earlier, thinking Eve would enjoy them. Then the time had come to celebrate Eve's birthday. After the ordeal of requesting permission to use the royal palace as banquet hall, Aaron went into Eve's chamber that morning and gently roused her from her slumber. Upon Eve's awakening, Aaron grabbed up her little body and informed her that it was her special day. He was overjoyed to be the first to wish Eve a happy birthday, so he wished his sister a very happy birthday as well. Since Eve had already woken up from her sleep, the servants immediately prepared Eve for her birthday party. A small blue and white dress was placed on Eve's body. As they dressed her, Eve enjoyed looking at herself in the large mirror as much as she did on her birthday, and she looked stunning. Her parents and Cedric entered her room shortly after. Upon seeing this stunningly gorgeous Eve, they were taken aback. On her birthday, her father came over to give her his best wishes. Since Eve was upset that her father wasn't the first to say it to her, she avoided her gaze from him when he thought he was the first to say it. Even though he was a bit worried by his daughter's expression, Eve's father swiftly talked with her and informed her that he had something special planned. He embraced Eve and announced that they were all to travel to the Imperial Palace since the present had already been prepared there. Eve was shocked to hear that because she hated being in such a large gathering. In spite of her emotions and her desire for others to end her family's extravagant festivities, her small body could not resist writhing in her father's embrace, and she had no choice but to comply with her father's plan. Hugo apparently went to great efforts to celebrate Eve's birthday, preparing a dining hall in the Imperial Palace and even ordering a new carriage with amenities to avoid vibration and repel insects. Taking care of even the smallest details proved his love for Eve, and his preparations were a reflection of that. The trip to the Imperial Palace was brief, but they eventually reached their destination. People in their finest attire were milling around the Imperial Palace's dinner hall while musical ensembles played in the background. They had heard that Eve was just as stunning as her mother, so naturally, the guests couldn't stop praising her. Though they did say some positive things, they also said some bad things. It was said that the birthday party for Eve was too extravagant because it took place in a banquet hall, and the chair that Eve would sit on was as luxurious as the emperor's. The night broke the bad news that the Artina family had arrived and would be entering the dining hall soon. Among the noise of visitors and negative comments. In order to fully appreciate the host's presence, they all fell into a momentary silence. Everyone at the party was staring at them, but even particular as soon as the Artina family arrived. The knight also let the visitors know that the emperor would be entering the room shortly. Not only did Hugo not expect Carlyle's attendance at Eve's birthday celebration, but neither did everyone else. The look of confusion on the guests' faces as a result of his arrival was obvious to Carly. After then, he explained to everyone that he had come to celebrate his best friend's daughter's birthday. As a result of the emperor's explanation, the guests' shock eased. Hugo was then invited by the emperor to give a speech to the invited guests. Hugo positioned himself to stand behind Eve, who was seated in the center of a luxurious chair. He thanked Carlyle for coming to Eve's birthday party and making it such a memorable occasion. He extended his gratitude to everyone who welcomed his invitation. He thanked everyone and then announced that Eve would be taking charge of the Artina household. As soon as he delivered this essential bit of information, his expression darkened to that of a tiger poised to attack. Through this expression, he hoped no one would turn against the Artina family, but he also threatened them. The terrified expressions on the faces of the palace guests who caught wind of Hugo's statement were a direct result of the terrifying expression on his face, which resembled that of an enraged lion. But Carlyle thought this was humorous, so he chuckled to lighten the mood, knowing full well that Hugo had anger even now. Then out of nowhere, a group of visitors approached Hugo and began talking with him in an attempt to get his attention. As a birthday present, one of them intended to offer Eve a unique and gorgeous bracelet, while another abruptly complimented Eve on her looks. Eve listened sleepily as Hugo seemed a little perplexed by the reactions of a few of the visitors who abruptly came over to speak to him. The other visitors were taken aback by Eve's drowsy expression, but they couldn't help but notice her beautiful eyes. Eve's eyes were quite similar to her mother's with the exception of the color of their hair. After a while, Lucius de Pontmark showed up unannounced for Eve's birthday celebration. The Crown Prince of Ardea Kingdom is his son's father-in-law. Hugo recognized Lucius's dark side, which sought to use the Crown Prince's power, and he thought he couldn't get along with that side. Consequently, he embarrassed Lucius and the assembled audience by declaring his unwelcome visitor. But Lucius, who responded with laughter and compliments on Eve's attractiveness, clearly wasn't taking anything seriously. Cedric hurried his sister away from the peculiar circumstance the moment he noticed it. He escorted Eve to a separate room and informed Aaron that their father's attitude toward Lucius was quite peculiar. There, Aaron detailed the reasons behind his father's disapproval of Lucius, which arose from the Empress of A.R. Cardi's death a year earlier in Lucius's woeful use of his son-in-law to secure a place in the kingdom. In due course, suddenly Eve's vision became blurry as she sat between her two brothers eating snacks while Cedric and Aaron were talking. She was perplexed as to how her eyes could have an unusual desensitization at such a young age, but her worst fears were immediately answered when fish began to swarm her. Her anxiety level decreased, and she yelled out lots of screams as a defense mechanism. Suddenly, a water spirit appeared right in front of her. It was the soul of the child she had rescued from the lake's surface in a past life. Who was this water spirit? An invitation to form a contract between human life and spirits was the reason the water spirit came to her life. If she has entered into a contract with the water spirit, a symbol of loyalty will subsequently appear on her forehead. It was unclear to Eve why she was asked to enter into a contract with a spirit. Carlyle strongly rejected the guests' claims. Carlyle ordered silence as the spirit contract symbol caused the atmosphere in the dining area to become unpleasant. At that moment, he did his best to hide his feelings. He proceeded to emphasize to the attendees that the preceding symbol had no significance compared to Eve's birthday. He also reminded the guests that they were nothing without the spirit's blessing and that their presence in the banquet hall was evidence of that. Lucius appeared displeased by Carlyle's statements to the guests, however, the reason behind his expression remained a mystery. Then, out of the blue, Carlyle requested permission from Cedric to hold Eve. The request naturally made Cedric worried because he feared for his sister's safety in Carlyle's care. Hugo attempted to reassure Carlyle, but his efforts were in vain as he exploded in anger. Also, he wanted to make sure his child was safe with Carlyle, so he offered to hold him until Carlyle calmed down. The emperor tried to cool down, but he was too enraged by the reports that the kingdom had lost the spirit's favor. He felt he needed to try holding Eve to calm his upset heart. As the emperor prepared to carry her, Eve had the notion that since he was her father's boss, she should be nice to him because he was the only one who could feed her family. Even as the emperor drew nearer to Eve's body, her small hands reached for the neck of his shirt and a sweet expression spread across his face, capturing his heart as well. Of course, the emperor fell head over heels for Eve once her cunning plan worked. As he embraced her, the emperor smiled widely and commanded Eve to raise the crown prince with love. No matter how much Eve protested about not wanting to be the crown prince's guardian, people would always interpret her protests as an adorable display of babyish innocence. Out of the blue, the emperor informed the banquetgoers that the kingdom's sorceress Eve had been born and that the celebration would be continued for 3 days in her honor. Hugo and Alicia were the only ones who did not joyfully celebrate the 3 days since Eve's entrance as a sorceress in the kingdom. They had been worried about her safety. They expected a lot of people to want to get close to Eve. Hugo appointed the Northern Knights to protect Eve because he and his wife were terrified that Lucius was plotting something bad that could have fatal consequences for Eve. The 4 Artina Knights Harold, Dwell, Alex, and Ken, now positioned in the northern woodland, were already apprised of the news of the Knights' recruitment to protect Eve. There are a number of reasons why they have become well known in the area. For example, they were thought to be stronger than the Emperor's Knights. The second reason was that they had been banished north by the Duke of Artina due to their disruptive behavior in the dormitory. The outlandishness of their behavior extended to the murder of the royal families of the monarchs who had come before them. On top of that, they take pleasure in killing devils, so the community labeling them as wild wolves is hardly surprising. Hale, who had been a servant to the Duke of Artina for 10 years, had been waiting to see them arrive. Now he was the butler at the Duke's mansion. It irritated him to have to welcome the rebellious Northern Knights. Hale found no humor in their jokes and instead grew irritated. It was made fun of that they would grill the horse on the royal grounds despite the fact that the Duke's wife had raised it. He suppressed his displeasure and moaned to himself about how the Duke's mansion had invited these annoying people. He had to suppress his rage for the sake of his career, which he had built over the past decade. Shortly thereafter, Eve made her appearance before the knights. The initial plan was for the knights to head to the courtyard in search of the horse they intended to devour. That is until Eve summoned them and made her appearance before the knights. Everyone was taken aback when they saw Eve. In their responses, it turned out that she was incredibly charming and lovely. Not knowing who she was dealing with, Eve was taken aback to see them all. After that, Hale told everyone that they were Ara's knights in an effort to catch Eve's eye. Dwell, Harold, and Alex hurriedly introduced themselves and boasted about their talents beyond swordplay. They were behaving like children, so Halil attempted to intervene in the behavior of the knights. Nevertheless, it was of no concern to Eve, who smiled as she handed one of the knights the berries from her basket. She explained that she was pleased to meet him. The grateful knight refused to return to the north after receiving the berries because he was so overjoyed. Like the first knight, the second one said he would rather not engage the northern devils in battle. The energy in the courtyard was obvious to Hugo. As the knights approached, he greeted them. Then, just as Hugo was going to return the salute, another voice rose to the occasion and did so first. When Hugo heard that voice, he was taken aback. It was perplexing to the knights as well that the Duke of Artina opened his mouth but made a screechy sound with his voice. The sound was actually Eve's attempt at mimicking her father's and the knights' voices. Upon noticing this amusing conduct, the knights hurried over to her and requested that she repeated it until they neglected to realize that they had disregarded Duke Artina. Hugo was overjoyed that the knights preferred his daughter and had no issue with that. He then informed the Artinanites that they would be selecting a single knight to serve as Eve's bodyguard, and they had to put in a month of training before Eve herself picked them. Eve unexpectedly made the knights embark on an adventure a month later. As they were rehearsing, she was carrying a self-prepared lunch and a bag of fruits and sweets. Since Eve was getting ready for a picnic rather than an adventure, the knights were unable to stand how adorable she was. Aaron quickly arrived at Eve's side, unable to bear the thought of her leaving him alone after hearing that Aaron and the knights were off on an expedition. Eve was overjoyed, but the knights entertained Eve with tales of their adventures before they set out, and she listened intently. Suddenly, Hugo showed up and cut off the knight's tale mid-sentence. Eve was one of several who were taken aback. Hugo showed up so he could inquire as to which knight Eve would like to have as her guardian. As the knights started to fret over whether or not they would be chosen by Eve, Eve remained silent for a minute to contemplate. After giving it some thought, Eve made her way to one of the knights, Ken. Ken was appointed as her guardian knight by her choice. At the same time, the other knights were disappointed that Eve had not selected them because he refrained from approaching Eve as much as his other knight friends did. During that month, Ken was surprised when Eve chose him to be the guardian knight. Eve had selected him, knowing Ken's backstory. Hugo also agreed with Eve's decision. Ken was once a lowly rural boy who came dangerously close to death at the hands of his boss's messenger. Ken was about to die, but thankfully, Hugo witnessed what was happening and rushed over to save him. Hugo then elevated him to the rank of knight. Ken thought his life was saved from the abyss of darkness and transformed into a bright life in the palace because of this. He committed his life to safeguarding Eve. The next morning, her brother would wake Eve up like he always did. She specifically requested to be carried despite her repeated assurances to him that she was an adult who wished to acquire swordsmanship. But she didn't give a hoot about what she said since she believed she was a child in the morning and an adult at night. Eve was irritated because she still wanted to be treated like a child in the morning, and Aaron, who had seen Cedric carrying her, had expressed the same thing. Since they were planning to eat breakfast together, Cedric carried Eve. A letter was waiting for Eve when she settled into her desk chair. No one could tell her what it was. When she questioned her brothers, the Marquis Cassis had extended an invitation to Eve. It turned out she hurried over to inform Harold about her excitement at receiving the invitation letter. Harold told Eve that the Cassis family had a remarkable history of witches that had been passed down through many generations. At the same time, the Marquis Cassis was close with Eve's father, and they frequently fought side by side whenever a royal dispute arose. But Harold's expression darkened after telling Eve that. Eve pondered the cause of Harold's apparent melancholy. Evidently, he was sad because he had no idea who he would be playing with if he visited Cassis' palace. After that, Eve told Harold he needed to start acting like an adult now that he was one. Harold was taken aback when Eve, who was incredibly youthful, told him to grow up. The day had come for the Artina family to go to Cassis' castle. While her parents prepared to get into the carriage, Eve continued to play with the knights' dolls. The knights weren't imparting any valuable life lessons to Eve, so her mother couldn't make sense of what she was witnessing. It all started when she watched the knights instructing Eve in a series of foolish habits like yelling at ghosts if they showed up unexpectedly, turning down food invitations, kicking people in the stomach if they hit her, and finally screaming if someone dragged her body. Eve's mom had to put up with her irritation even though she couldn't stand to see it. She watched as her husband summoned the knights while she suppressed her irritation. She was under the impression that her husband was going to discipline the knights for imparting meaningless knowledge to Eve. Sadly, she was incorrect. Rather, her husband called them to inform them that training would not be taking place today due to a visit to Cassis' palace. Even after Eve boarded the carriage, the knights' foolish behavior continued. Even though everyone begged for the chance to visit Cassis' palace, the Duke of Artina ultimately sent only Karen and Eden. The drama with the knights was finally over, and Hera's family departed along the path. Eve laid eyes on a large, battered plush bunny. Eve requested her father look at the doll, but he mistook her request for a request that Eve wanted to get a rabbit doll as well, leading him to instruct the servant to purchase a large doll for Eve. It was really just the size of the doll that prompted Eve to tell her father, but her dad insisted on getting Eve a large toy bunny as a companion for one of Eve's dolls. Eve gave this teddy bear multiple tasks. Its primary role was to be Eve's company during meals, sleep, and playtime. Her father naturally went out of his way to get her yet another doll because she had expressed an interest in creating an animal forest out of dolls. During her conversation with her father about dolls, Eve had the realization that she is alone and her only friends are actual dolls. When she wanted to know how many friends would be visiting Cassis' castle, she questioned Cedric. Cedric assured them that the gathering planned by the Marquis would attract a large number of friends and family members. Because Eve had hoped to make many friends upon her return from that place, she was overjoyed to hear that. The fact that Eve's father has never had much luck making friends makes him concerned about her desire. The thought of his daughter making friends made him nervous. He claims that those who approached him were merely interested in discovering his vulnerabilities, thus making it nearly impossible for him to have friends who were genuinely honest with him. After a lengthy journey, Eris' family finally reached the palace of Cassis, where the Marquis greeted them with open arms. Even the Marquis's greeting was too much for Hugo. Afterwards, Hugo was informed by the Marquis that meeting Eve was his top priority. Eve heard the Marquis say that and greeted him at once. Eve met the Marquis's 2 kids at the gathering. Ian and Lillian were their names. Ian greeted Eve warmly and softly held her hand. Ian appeared as though he was about to kiss Eve's hand, which caught their father off guard. They had no idea that Ian was secretly watching Eve as he held her hand. As Ian grasped Eve's hand, the message from Aaron about how he was like a sheep reappeared in her mind. Because she is still a little girl, Eve can't understand the meaning of what Aaron is saying. Ian seemed more like a wolf with a delicate tail movement to her, so she pondered why he was called a sheep. Afterwards, the Marquis called Lillian to meet Eve, who had been hidden behind Ian's body. As she approached Eve, she introduced herself. After that, she told Eve that with a little begging, she hoped they could be friends in the future. Eve was taken aback by Lillian's statements and went silent for an apparent reason. Due to Eve's lack of response, Lillian speculated that she might not want to be friends with her since she was only a weak girl. She wasn't sure how Eve could take her in as a friend. Afterwards, the Marquis approached them and told Eve that Lillian had few friends since she was a weak child. The Marquis suggested that they become friends because they both didn't have many friends. Eve thought about the Marquis's explanation and quickly reached her hand to Lillian in appreciation for Lillian's friendship. She requested that Lillian care for her. Lillian was overjoyed that Eve expressed interest in becoming her friend. After that, they had together play in the palace. After getting a snack box, Lillian presented it to Eve. Eve eagerly opened her mouth for Lillian to feed her treats. As soon as she saw what was inside the box, whenever Lillian wanted to feed Eve, she would call on her lady. This happened multiple times since Eve wasn't happy when Lillian used that term. She politely requested that she use her name only from now on. Lillian was hesitant about approving Eve's requests at first, but she soon gave in since she thought Eve was so cute. Watching their younger siblings in activity, Eve and Lillian's brother sat close by, adding to their watching. Aside from observing from a distance, it appears that Ian went so far as to compliment Eve in front of Aaron and Cedric, remarking on how she shone like a little star. He came to this conclusion due to the fact that Eve looked really gorgeous, her golden hair was stunning, her eyes were blue like the ocean, and she was loved by the spirits. Also, he gets it now. Eve is adored by everyone because she's so cute and joyful all the time. Upon hearing Ian praise his sister, Aaron became enraged, but Ian subdued Aaron by explaining that he'd rather have an older woman with abilities that he could learn from than a young female with none. After hearing Ian's remarks, Aaron became even more irritated and threatened Ian with consequences if he changed his mind. It seems that Aaron and Ian continued their argument. After that, the conversation regarding Eve was carried on by Ian. He expressed his sympathy for the man who was going to marry Eve, saying that he had to win over Aaron and Cedric while also sacrificing his life for Aaron's family. Unexpectedly, Cedric got so irritated by Ian's words that he got up from his seat and attempted to attack him. When they had finished visiting the palace, they stepped outdoors to mingle with one another because the gathering spot for kids and their parents was separate. A maid led them to the garden. Aaron and Ian were taken aback by the sight of kids sobbing over dolls and a few spilled drinks. As they reached the children's part of the park's environment was so chaotic that it seemed like hell to them. They decided to have a sword fight somewhere else because they didn't want to be there. Even after reaching an agreement, they still didn't know what to do with their siblings. Then out of nowhere, Eve pointed to a location she wanted to visit. As her brother looked perplexed, furthermore, when he pointed in that direction, Lillian wished she could too. Ian was taken aback when he saw his sibling, who had never shown any interest in playing with him before. However, this time, his sibling insisted on going to play with Eve right away. Ian thereafter told Lillian and Eve to call him if they became victims of harassment. Responding to Ian's message, Eve showed a creepy but not scary look and said that she was able at self-defense because she had been taught by the Ardennanites. Earlier, a large number of children were in the area when Eve and Lillian came. All eyes centered on Eve as she entered the area. Taken aback by her stunning attractiveness, indeed, the other kids had heard about Eve's stunning good looks before. The sight of them made Eve anxious, but she attempted to calm herself by convincing herself that they were actually just stones with faces, noses, mouths, and feet. A sense of relief washed over her as she made her way past the crowd of children to a parked chair. However, as she sat there for some time, a number of other girls approached her to make small talk. She didn't know how to interact with her new friends until she started to question whether it was appropriate to defend herself at this moment. Among the many kids who were eager to meet Eve, a young girl with a red dress and silver hairstyle came out of nowhere to greet her. She was Lucius, the Pont's daughter. Ciri, the Pont Marite. Eve attempted to recall the name Pont after sensing a familiarity with it, but she couldn't figure out that Ciri was Lucius's daughter. Thinking back, she recalled that Lucius had been a guest at her birthday celebrations. Her certainty that Ciri was Lucius's daughter was further strengthened when she noticed that her snake-like eyes resembled Lucius. Ciri greeted Eve, and although Eve's body was still positioned on the chair, she returned the greeting. But that wasn't good enough for Ciri, she found it impolite. Her next message to Eve was to stand up when she answered. Furthermore, she cautioned Eve about causing trouble during the party due to her attitude. Since she assumed Eve was unknowing in manners, she couldn't help but laugh. This, of course, irritated Eve. Following that, they both stared. They were both engaged in their own thoughts. Since Eve assumed the person standing before her was bad, she put on an unhappy expression. Ciri, meanwhile, laughed because Eve was supposedly not as stunning as everyone claimed. There seemed to be an electric current flowing from their eyes as they stared at one another endlessly. Due to Eve's lack of response, Ciri was lost in thought. After hearing so many people praise Eve, she began to believe that Eve was even more foolish than she had thought to imagine. The fact that people's compliments had stopped coming in ever since Eve was born made her very angry. Everyone said she was the most promising empress candidate, a wonderful child, and the future queen of society. All of that, however, faded away when the monarch revealed that Eve would be the heir to the kingdom. The fact that she overheard her father talking about the impending domination of Ar's family gave her the opportunity to enslave Eve. The truth, though, was quite different. It was instead announced to the nobility that Eve will one day rule the kingdom. After that, Ciri brought up Ar's knights to irritate Eve. Since she still hadn't spoken, she made fun of the Artina knights for going back to the palace rather than face the northern demon head-on. Ciri's comments, in which she insulted the Artina family's knights, infuriated Eve. But Ciri was pleased because she had succeeded in getting Eve to speak. Ciri's happiness was fleeting as Eve unleashed her spirit ability to assault Ciri. Ciri and Lillian were taken aback by Eve's appearance as she concentrated on creating water with her skills. Then, once the water had been created, Eve hurled it upon Ciri's body until it was wet. As Ciri's expression changed from angry to irritated, Eve was overjoyed that she had successfully attacked Ciri. As the fight between Ciri and Eve was about to get worse, a terrible noise was suddenly audible among the nearby bushes within the garden area. A cloud of red smoke rose. When they saw what was happening, they were both taken aback. The kids in the park sprang into a panic and bolted in all directions. But as one of them looked into the red smoke for an object, he recognized the Dantalion, one kind of demon that disobeys the 72 others. As scary as it must be for humans, their lack of intelligence and fear causes them to destroy everything in their sight. When Eve heard a boy say Dantalion, she had no idea what he meant. As Eve was still confused, one of Ciri's friends pushed her body, causing her to fall closer to Dantalion. Despite her frustration with Ciri's friend, she attempted to use her abilities to fight off Dantalion as she fell. But Dantalion struck out at her in the midst of her attempt. Feeling fortunate, Eve swiftly blocked Dantalion's move. Pulling on Dantalion, she yelled out for her parents and brother at the same time. Surprisingly, though, there was indeed a single remaining Dantalion. Eve made her move to assault the other.